this evening's speaker, Lesley Downer, needs very little introduction, I think, partly because she's spoken here several times before, but also because she's a very well-known author about Japan. And on the blurb that I've got here, she's listed a number of her historical novels, but actually goes back to recipe books, and a book that my mother was a huge fan of, Walking in the Steps of Basho. So Lesley has done all sorts of things about Japan, but in recent years she's been focusing on writing historical novels set in Japan around the end of the Edo period, beginning of the Meiji period. And of course that's exactly the period she's going to be talking about today. So maybe more of a novelist's eye view than a historian's view, but there's a lot of research goes into Lesley's work. So I'll leave it at that. Pass it to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, for that introduction, and thank you everybody very much for coming. Great to see everybody, and great to be back here at the Daiwa Foundation. And, well, today is, I gather, is this working? Are you all right on the sound levels? Is that a thumbs up at the back?
It is.
Right, okay. Today is, I gather, exactly 1 year since Donald Trump came to power. Very, well, I'm not quite sure what sort of day that is, but anyway, it is. And he is in Asia, as you know, and he has been roaming around. He's been in Japan. He spoke to the emperor. I think he commented on the fact that mass shootings were commonplace wherever you go, something like this. And he also had dealings with Prime Minister Abe. So it's sort of apropos that my talk today is all about some other Americans who visited Japan and who also had dealings with a prime minister or a chief minister, a roju, called Abe. So my story begins with possibly the most dramatic and the most momentous event in the whole history of Japan. And we're going to wind back the clock to July the 8th, 1853. And you guys are all fishermen. You are all Japanese fishermen, and your little fishing boats are at the mouth of Edo Bay. And your boats are becalmed. It's a windless day. And so you're putting in your nets. It's going to be another day, just like every other day that's ever been. And you look up and you see on the horizon 4 completely mammoth ships heading towards you. It's the most terrifying, most unimaginable thing you could possibly see. So if you saw the film Independence Day and you remember those massive spaceships above every city in the land, which were just bigger than a spaceship can ever be, they were impossibly big. These ships were just the same. They were impossibly big. They were 15 times bigger than the biggest Japanese ship. And they were moving an awful lot faster than any ship could ever possibly move. Added to which, it was a windless day, so how on earth were they moving in the first place? So they were charging along, and they had smoke coming out of them, a bit like dragons. So the fishermen, you the fishermen, turn your boats and you head to shore, and you reported, here are the words, that the ships loomed as large as mountains and travelled as swiftly as birds, and 2 were afire with smoke pouring out of them. So you show up, you get back to shore, you sound the alarm, you turn up in the great city of Edo, which is now known as Tokyo. And of course, the guides there are an awful lot more sophisticated than you humble fishermen. And they know exactly what this is. It is indeed an alien invasion, but it's not Martians, it's Americans. It's Commodore Perry and his 4 black ships, and they actually drop anchor at the mouth of Edo Bay, which is not very far from the great city of Edo, and they turn their cannons on the little town there, the little town of Uruga. So guard boats swarm out to intercept these ships. And on these guard boats, besides soldiers, there are artists, of course. And the artists are sketching away. I mean, here is a chance for the sale of the century. So some of them are on these ships. Other artists didn't even bother going out to see the ships. They just used their imagination. It's fake news, if you like. They knew there was going to be a massive demand for pictures of the black ships. There were actually 500,000 Edo commoners who were not allowed by law to go all the way down to Uruga and have a look at the black ships. So the best they could do was buy these woodblock prints. It was an absolute windfall for the artist, you can imagine. And some artists just took prints of Dutch ships. The prints you could always get were of Dutch ships, the Nagasaki prints, and even left the Dutch ship in place, but they put in paddle wheels, because these American ships have paddle wheels. That did, they sold lots and lots and lots. They all got, fairly rich fairly quickly. So who were these invaders? Okay, well, as probably you know, but I'll just remind you, Japan had been closed to the outside world, except for Chinese and Korean traders for more than 200 years, something like 250 years, since 1639, except for Dejima Island off Nagasaki, where there were 20 Dutch merchants who could come and trade. And there was also a Dutch ship that turned up most years, not every year, but most years, and that gave the Japanese knowledge of the West, and they could also buy Western artifacts, they could buy Western science, Western technological objects, and there were schools of Dutch knowledge. So Nagasaki was Japan's window to the West. Now the Japanese, we probably didn't know a whole lot, we British, about Japan, but the Japanese knew, for example, all about the Opium Wars, which had gone on from 1839 to 1842. And so they knew that about British incursions into China. So Britannia ruled the waves. So how come it wasn't the British that turned up at Japan's door? Well, it was the Crimean War. The Crimean War, think of it as a football match. It was Britain and France versus Russia. So that took all three, Britain, France, Russia, out of the picture. They're all busy fighting in Crimea. So that left the way open for the fledgling United States of America, which had only been around for not very long, since the War of Independence had been finished in 1783, so it was only some 60 years earlier. And the California gold rush was at its height. Do you remember Clementine and the 49ers? So we're now in 1853. So the whole problem began with whaling. It was whaling. Moby Dick had been published in 1851. People lit their homes, people in America, with whale oil lamps. Women used baleen whale bones in their crinolines. And there was industrial machinery which was lubricated with whale oil. So for several decades, whaling ships from New England have been plying the rich waters around Hokkaido. But number one, they were not allowed to put in for supplies because no foreigners could land in Japan. And number two, when their sailors were shipwrecked, they were quite badly treated. They ended up getting hustled off, usually in a cage, down to Nagasaki and getting put in prison. So in Moby Dick, Herman Melville wrote, "If that double-bolted land, Japan, is ever to become hospitable, it is the whale ship alone to whom the credit will be due, for already she is on the threshold." And in November 1851, President Millard Fillmore instructed Commodore Matthew Perry to deliver a letter to the Japanese Emperor demanding just those two things. One, that American whalers could put in to one or two ports of call just to get some coal. And secondly, that castaways be treated humanely. So those were the only demands. That was why the Americans showed up in Japan in 1853. And in fact, the Japanese knew they were coming because the Dutch King Willem, who was a great ally of the shogun, obviously, because Dutch were living in Nagasaki, actually sent a letter to the shogun warning him that there was a fleet on its way with 2 steamers and 2 sailing ships, and that they'd better open up or there would be, some trouble. So when the Japanese officials in Edo heard about the black ships, they knew exactly what they were. And they were perfectly able to do a perfectly normal drawing of black ships if they felt so inclined. So who were on the black ships? Well, there was a missionary called Samuel Wells Williams, and he wrote in his journal that this is the coming of the universal Yankee nation to disturb Japan's apathy and long ignorance. Commodore Matthew Perry, he knew very well all about the Japanese. As far as he knew, they were sly, untrustworthy, devious, and duplicitous, and they were full of tricks and delays. And he absolutely was not going to be having with any of that. He was going to bust through this Japanese messing about. So there was a journalist on board called Bayard Taylor, and he recorded this comment from Perry. And there were also 2 artists. Wilhelm Heine and Eliphalet Brown. And their work appears in the narrative of the expedition, which was by Perry himself and by Francis Hawkes. And this is what Perry must have seen as he sailed towards the mouth of Edo Bay. I was actually on a ship, and I took this picture, heading towards the mouth of what is now Tokyo Bay. And it probably looked quite a bit like that. It probably wasn't a cable car, but other than that, it was probably pretty similar. So here is Nagasaki, which is where you were supposed to go if you were a foreigner. And here is the Uraga Channel, which is where Perry and his men turned up. And here is Edo, which is now Tokyo. So you can see they were actually blocking the entrance to the channel that led. It was a very threatening activity. They were blocking the channel to the, blocking the entrance to the channel that led to the capital city. And this is as far as they came in July 1853, just here. And here we have Point Rubicon, which was the Rubicon, which I'll talk about to you in a minute, which was the sort of the neck of the bay. Beyond that, you're in Edo Bay itself. And so you've actually entered, you know, the Japanese waters. And up here, 5 miles, which for young people you'd know as 8 kilometers, is Edo, which is Tokyo. So here was Commodore Perry and his 4 massive, massive black ships. So these ships, one of them, the flagship, was called the Susquehanna. It was 15 times as big as, it was the size of the 15 biggest Japanese ships all put together. It was that big, 15 times bigger than any Japanese ships. There were 2 steamships and 2 sailing ships, 61 guns, 967 men. And this was the Mississippi. This was sketched by a guy called Tsutsumi Isuemon, who lived in the village of Isogo, little tiny village which later became known as a little part of Yokohama. And they entered Edo Bay at nearly 9 knots, which is incredibly fast. And the fishermen, as Bayard, the journalist, wrote, fled for shore like wild birds at a sudden intruder. So the view of the Americans was that guard boats rowed by tall athletic men naked, save for a cloth around the loins, surrounded the ships, and the Americans drove them off with pikes. And the officials on board the guard ships held up a huge sign which said, "Depart immediately and dare not anchor." This is the Japanese, written in French. Why in French, I don't know, but anyway, it was written in French. "Depart immediately and dare not anchor." Now the key person that you need to know about was on these boats, and his name was Kayama Ezaemon. He was a police magistrate from the little town of Uraga. He was he was an aide to one of the 2 governors of Uraga. And he was a very bright guy, and he was on this boat, and he counted how many cannons there were on the ship. He counted 70, and he could see that they were more powerful than any cannons that the shogunate had. He knew the shogunate had about 100 cannons around Edo Bay, but these could easily outgun them. Well, Perry's whole plan of action was to pull rank. So first of all, he would not even be seen, but he wouldn't let anybody on board who was not of sufficiently high rank. So he said, we can't have this Kayama on board. He's only a police magistrate, won't have him. Who do you have who's of higher rank? So the Japanese offered Nakajima Saburonosuke. And here indeed is Nakajima Saburonosuke. And he's meeting Commander Franklin Buchanan. Actually, Nakajima Saburonosuke was just the other police magistrate. But the Japanese had cottoned on by then that, you know, it didn't matter if the Americans didn't quite get what was going on, that was fine. So this was the first example of the Americans having the wool pulled over their eyes. So Nakajima came on, and he asked the obvious question when you meet the aliens. So they said something like, "Take me to your leader," and he said, "Why are you here?" which was a good question. And the Americans said they had a letter to deliver to the emperor. Well, this was kind of funny because the emperor was someone that most people probably didn't even know existed. He lived in seclusion somewhere in Kyoto. He was like, why the emperor? This is like the Pope or something. So anyway, Nakajima didn't say anything about that, but he did say they had to go to Nagasaki because that was where foreigners had to go. And the Americans answered. They said, well, okay, if you won't take our letter, we will go on shore with a whole lot of troops and a whole lot of guns and we'll deliver it. So obviously they didn't want that to happen. So meanwhile, in Edo, rumours are reaching the people about what's happening. And there's panic. There's growing panic. The government declares a state of emergency. And the daimyo, you know what daimyo are? The daimyo are like dukes or princes or lords or something. The daimyo, in charge of the defence of Edo Bay, rush off to rally their troops. So you have soldiers heading for the coast with drums mounted on wheels and hauling cannon on the one hand, and then you have fear-stricken villagers running in the other direction with their possessions on their back. So people near the coast are already running as fast as they can to get away from these horrendous intruders. And that evening, the Americans see thousands of boats in the bay. Tons and tons of people had come out on boats to have a look at these great big ships. And they were on guard throughout the night because they were very concerned that the Japanese might send fire ships. They might send ships on fire into the midst of the American ships. But the Japanese didn't. And also there was a comet. And the Japanese never said anything about the comet. But the Americans, there was a clerk called J.S. Spalding, and he thought it was probably a good omen. He said, we may pray God, he wrote this in his journal, we may pray God that our present attempt to bring a singular and half barbarous people into the family of civilized nations may succeed without resort to bloodshed. So that's day 1, July the 8th. Day 2, the Americans sent out a survey boat to survey up towards Edo, and they crossed the Rubicon. They went through that little neck of land that I showed you, and they headed up towards Edo. And from the point of view of the Americans, we're doing a survey. Unknown territory, we're doing a survey. Behind this little boat was the Mississippi, this massive great steamer. As far as the Japanese are concerned, this is really threatening. I mean, this blooming great steamship is blasting up towards Edo. So there were 2 interpreters who were allowed on board. They're called Moriyama Yenosuke and Tako Juro. And they are able to talk to the lower ranking officers because they're not high enough rank to talk to the higher ranking officers. No Japanese has seen Perry. He's been hiding. Perry keeps well out of the way. He's way too grand to speak to any of these lowly people. And Kayama, our friend, is the chief go-between. Bayard Taylor, the journalist, describes him as being dressed in an elaborate overgarment of silk embroidered with gold and silver peacock feathers, so he cuts quite a dash. And Perry then, through his men, offers an ultimatum that Kayama has 3 days to come up with an answer. 3 days. Or the Americans are going to go on shore with all their heavily armed troops. And meantime, the American survey boat has seen that the Japanese are not very well armed. The fortifications are small and weak. So the Japanese too know perfectly well that they can't resist American force, but it would be humiliating to give way under threat of attack. So the next day, the 3rd day, it's Sunday. This means nothing to the Japanese, but to the Americans, they stop doing anything. They have a service on shipboard, so phew, there's a breather. Japanese are constructing forts, troops rushing about, they're test firing their cannons. And in Edo, here's a map of Edo, rumours are running wild that the Americans are coming. So here's, the Americans are down here somewhere, there's Mount Fuji. Here, always hidden on these maps, is the Shogun's castle, because you don't want to show the enemy the way into your castle. And this is the Sumida River. And so those rumours are running wild. Here is a little photograph of Edo, the roofs of Edo. And the next day, it's Monday. Okay, day 4. More survey boats. I was wrong, by the way. At this point, those survey boats cross the Rubicon. Here they are crossing the Rubicon. And there is the Mississippi in the distance. There is the survey boat with the Americans on it. Here are the Japanese keeping a good eye on it, thinking, oh my God, what's happening? It's heading up towards Edo. And there's more and more panic. In fact, one of the first things that the government does is to mobilize troops to protect the daimyo mansions. In fact, the mansions of the Lord of Satsuma, which are down in Shinagawa. So that's the first place that the Americans are going to come to. And the Lord of Satsuma is also very, very powerful. So here is a little, this is Shinagawa. Those of you who've been there may well recognise it, or possibly not. This is the waterfront. And along the waterfront, there's orders to ring the fire bells if the Americans attack. So in the city, in Edo, here's Edo again, here's a quote from somebody writing at that time. The usually lively streets of Edo are filled with panicky commotion. So people are running back and forth, carrying their arms and furniture. People are buying up second-hand armour. The guys selling the armour are selling it for enormously high prices. They're selling old arms. People that live near the seacoast have begun to evacuate with their young and old. And the broad streets of the shogun's capital are packed with people running about in panic as they carry furniture and possessions. So the price of rice doubles, then it trebles, then it quadruples, and people are stockpiling food and supplies, and the city officials start to plan for a general evacuation of the populace. And meanwhile, so what are the gods doing? The priests are busy praying the gods like mad, saying, come on, you've got to do something about this. The government sends messengers to the grand shrine in Ueno with a gift of 100 plates of silver for the gods to get them to, to do something about this terrible threat to the country. Nothing's happened from the gods as yet. And there's another panicked midnight meeting in Edo Castle. So one big question is, who is to receive Perry's letter? None of the powerful men want to touch it. It's like it'll burn them. They don't want to touch this awful letter from the foreigners. And finally, they come up with a solution. And Kayama informs the Americans that the two princes of Izu, Toda Izunokami and Edo Iwami, will receive the letter. And here is a picture of Toda, Prince of Izu. The Americans believe them. Actually, he's not the Prince of Izu. He is the governor of the little tiny town of Uruga. And he thinks it's very funny. He's suddenly been promoted. It's like being promoted from Mayor of Camden to Duke of Westminster, just like that. So he thinks this is deeply hilarious, but obviously he's prepared to, show gravitas. And to celebrate, Kayama and the interpreters are taken on a tour of the American ship. And there the Americans, they have a globe. And obviously these barbaric Japanese won't know what this is, so they show it to Kayama. And he says, oh yeah, it's a globe. Well, this is New York, isn't it? Is that where you come from? And this is Washington, right? This is the Isthmus of Panama. And I believe you just built a canal there. And so the Americans write that they are surprised by the Japanese grasp of the general principles of science and of the facts of the geography of the world. And meanwhile, in Edo, people are fleeing, taking what they can carry. South of Edo, the roads are packed with gun carriages, and the price of rice and armour keeps rising. And there's been no fish available for 3 days. Then, the next day, Kayama brings a letter wrapped in velvet in a sandalwood box, which he says is from the emperor. He knows perfectly well it's not from the emperor, it's not from the shogun. In fact, Chief Minister Abe, not our Abe, but Abe Masahiro, he wrote the letter. But whatever, the Americans want a communication from the emperor. And so now the Americans are convinced that everything is fine, and they agree that the letter will be delivered. The Americans' letter will be delivered next morning. And Perry's very suspicious. He's sure there's going to be some sort of sneak attack. He has the ships brought in close to shore with the guns, all the big cannons trained on the beach. And meanwhile, the Japanese are building the hall where they're going to receive the letter. So all night long, there's incredible hammering going on, so the poor old Americans can't sleep for all this bang, bang, bang of the hammering. But the next day, there's a very nice, beautiful reception hall has been built. So nobody has yet seen Perry. But that doesn't stop the Japanese artists from making pictures of him, which will no doubt also would sell for an awful lot of money. And here's another picture of him. And then maybe at this point they had begun to get, maybe somebody had caught a glimpse of him. This is what he actually looked like. And this is him in the illustrated London News. It's not bad, those Japanese pictures. And here are the 4 black ships at Kurihama, and the Japanese warriors on the beach, and the Americans in their funny trousers, as finally the two sides meet. And here is another picture of the 4 black ships, and where are the Americans in their funny trousers, and lots and lots. There were 5,000 samurai waiting there to greet the Americans, plus some women peeking from behind screens, villagers too, 50 Japanese guard boats, each decorated with a red flag. And here is Commodore Perry landing at Kurihama. The Americans left their ships at 10 o'clock on the dot. There was a gun roll of 13 guns. I don't know if you've ever heard a cannon. I heard a cannon in St. Petersburg. It was so loud I jumped out of my skin. This is 13 guns going boom, boom, boom. So it's a bit intimidating. And Perry steps into his white barge, and 250 Americans go ashore. So Perry, just to impress the Japanese, he has on each side of him a huge black steward. 2 of the best-looking fellows of their colour that the squadron could furnish, is what he wrote, followed by 2 cabin boys carrying rosewood boxes wrapped in scarlet cloth, holding the letters, and the band plays Hail Columbia, and the procession goes up the hill to the reception hall. The Japanese officials are wearing brocaded silk overgarments trimmed with yellow velvet and embroidered with gold thread. So the American journalist Bayard Taylor wrote that one of them looked like an unusually brilliant knave of trumps, which wasn't very polite. Williams, the missionary, had to borrow a coat and a sword so that he would look kind of military enough. And he thought the Japanese outfits grotesque and piebald, though the effect was not unpleasant. And it was all so splendid, wrote the young clerk J.W. Spalding, it made me think I'd come to be a spectator at some joust or tourney. And the Japanese even managed to get armchairs for the Americans, and for Perry. And so the letter was delivered. And Toto was there to receive the 2 letters, one from President Fillmore pledging friendship and requesting the opening of relations, the other Perry's instructions to open negotiations on a treaty of amity between the 2 nations. So Perry said he would come back next April or May for his answer. So these were letters requesting the making of a treaty, right? So he would come back next year in April or May for his answer with more ships, he said, just driving the point home, adding more threat. And as they left, the Americans collected shells and stones from the beach and compared swords with the Japanese soldiers, though some of them noticed that some spectators stared at them with hostility. And they marched back to their ships to the strains of Hail Columbia and Yankee Doodle. So the Japanese thought, phew, done it now, had got the letter, maybe they'll go away now, leave us in peace, everything's fine now. Far from it. All the ships, all 4 massive ships, moved up closer to Edo, sounding their foghorns all the way. And the crowds gathered along the shore to see the American steamers. People offered the Americans water and fresh peaches, and the Americans shared tobacco with the Japanese. And the Americans were enchanted by the civility of the Japanese and enraptured by the beautiful countryside with its neat thatched roof villages, extensive cultivation, and intensely green groves of trees. They got to within 7 miles of Edo, these massive ships. They could actually see the low buildings from the outskirts. And finally Perry said, okay, we can turn around now. And the next day they retreated, and they went back to their original anchorage spot. And Kayama, our hero, Kayama, showed up with presents, including fans, and with shunga painted all over them, which is Japanese erotica. And obviously the Americans thought this was not very nice at all. Bayard Taylor wrote that they had these presents which showed hideously distorted and lackadaisical pictures of Japanese ladies, very distasteful. So the Americans thought the Japanese gifts were rather cheap, so they gave gifts that they thought would be of higher value. Tea, 3 histories of the United States. Must have been rather short, those histories, anyway. 3 histories of the United States. Cotton, loaf sugar, 3 swords, champagne, and whiskey. And Kayama pantomimed that he would be in tears when they left. And the next day, phew, they left. And there were at least 1,000 boats crowded up to the steamers to bid the Americans farewell. And after they had gone, the Japanese burnt the American presents on the beach. Well, there had been previous ships that had turned up, such as the French had turned up, and they'd said they would definitely come back, and they never had. So it was within the realms of possibility that Perry wouldn't come back. But just in case, Prime Minister Abe he did something which was absolutely fatal to the future of the shogun's government, which was, he thought, well, if I have to mobilize troops, that will be the daimyo, the 260 daimyo princes who rule the 260 princedoms. Each of them will be responsible for mobilizing troops. Therefore, instead of issuing orders, which was what the government had always done, he consulted them. He got them all together, he said, what do you think we should do? And this fatally undermined the shogunate. And another thing that happened was that the 12th Tokugawa shogun, who was ruling at the time, he was 60, Shogun Ieyasu, 2 weeks exactly after the Americans left, he died. And there are various different stories as to exactly why he died. Some people said that he'd been ill, he died. When Rutherford Alcock, the first British head of legation, arrived in Japan in 1860, he wrote that the word on the street in Edo was that the shogun had been offered a cup of poison and that he dashed it aside. His aide then took out his sword and basically sliced him up and then killed himself. And basically he had to take responsibility. The Americans had arrived on his watch. So he was succeeded by his son, who was the 13th Tokugawa shogun, Ieyasu. And the shogunate started basically building up its defences, building new batteries off Shinagawa, making a coastal defence system for Edo Bay. They ordered lots of things from the Dutch, many ships, guns, armaments, cannons. And importantly, there was a law up till then forbidding the 260 daimyo princes from building their own warships. You've got to keep them under control. So Abe repealed that law. So meanwhile, got one more picture of the handing over of the letter. Meanwhile, down in Kagoshima, right at the south of Japan, where Sakurajima looms, blasting out black ash and occasionally erupting to this day, the owner of this country house, right in the shadow of the volcano, was a man called Shimazu Nariakira. And he was keeping a wary eye on everything that was going on. He was the most enlightened, most well-informed, most brilliant of all the daimyo warlords. He spoke Dutch. He kept a diary in Dutch. He collected Western books. He admired Western technology. He had his own shipbuilding and armaments factories. And he was very close to Prime Minister Abe. He lived so far from Edo that he could basically get away with anything he wanted. He lived in his castle, Crane Castle, in Kagoshima half the time, and half the time in Edo. In those days, as you probably know, the princes had to go back and forth between their own princedom and Edo. He had a beautiful vessel, which I just showed you, called Senganen, and there, in the shadow of the cliff, looking out across to the volcano, to Sakurajima, he had an industrial complex. And in fact, the main building is still there. And there he had cannons, he had a cannon, he had cast cannons, and he had Japan's first glassworks. They made Satsuma glassware. And he already had a telegraph system. It was the only one in Japan. And he also had the first daguerreotype camera in Japan. He bought it from the Dutch. It came with an instruction manual, but rather like an instruction manual for a flat pack, it wasn't very easy to get the thing to work from the instruction manual. So he had 2 retainers working full time on trying to get the blooming thing to work. And finally, after about 4 years, they produced Japan's first photograph, which is of Crane Castle. And they then also produced a picture of Nariakira himself, which is 1857, and it's framed in gold and kept in Terukuni Shrine in Kagoshima, next to Crane Castle. Well, he believed that Japan should open its doors to trade, that trade would bring the technology needed to build up the military power to rebuff the West. And as soon as the law was repealed, prohibiting the building of gunships, he was ready to go. In fact, he already had gunships. They were all hidden under the shadow of the volcano. He knew that the West was ahead technologically. He knew about the Opium Wars. He knew about the threat of occupation and colonization. And he wanted very much to have a stronger grip on power himself. He was a control freak. He wanted to get some control. And he had a secret weapon. And his secret weapon was actually his cousin's daughter, who was initially known as Okatsu, but he adopted her. He made her his own daughter. He changed her name to Atsu. He made her Princess Atsu, Atsuhime. And he sent her off to marry the shogun, who was a young guy, the new shogun, because if she was married to the shogun, it would give him control over the reins of power. So she would have to travel from the deep south of Japan up to Edo to marry the shogun. And with her went someone that you may have heard of, Saigo Takamori, who is famous as the last samurai. He was 25 at the time, and he went with her to be an undercover agent to help her in her job of controlling the shogun. And this is the story that I tell in my novel, so I'm not going to tell you much of it, just a little bit. And they set off on their annual procession. They had a huge cavalcade of people travelling right across from Kagoshima in the deep south to Edo in the middle of Japan. It was about a 6-week journey. And it was April the 2nd when they passed Kanagawa, which is very, very near Yokohama, and they saw the black ships, which had come back early. So the Crimean War was still going on. That kept Britain, France, Turkey, Russia out of the picture. They're all busy fighting each other. Perry only went to Okinawa. He hung around in Okinawa and Macau, and he came back again. And 4 sailing ships came first. It was a bigger fleet this time. 4 sailing ships came first. They got caught up in a typhoon off Odawara in February. 2 ran aground off Kamakura. And then the steamships arrived, and they didn't mess about this time. They just took the sailing ships and they towed them right up into Edo Bay. So the Japanese again had to pull their socks up fast, and they named the rector of the official government university, who was a guy called Hayashi Daigaku, to be the head of the Japanese negotiating team. So he was the David Davis of Japan. And this was every bit as serious, more serious than the Brexit negotiations. This was serious. So the ships moved closer and closer to Edo till they were at Kanagawa, which is where Princess Atsu saw them. This is how Kanagawa looked in 1833 in Hiroshike's depiction. Lovely and peaceful, apart from these ladies pulling in chaps off the street. But other than that, very peaceful. 20 years later, this enormous commotion going on, and the American ships would have been over here somewhere. So initially, they're 5 miles from Edo. They're, 8 kilometers from Edo, very, very close. And they have initially 7 ships, then 2 more ships arrived. This is the Powhatan, all these great, big, immense, rather impressive ships, actually. And quite a lot of people just went out to have a jolly good look. So this chap has a telescope, yeah. And the Japanese, again, at top speed, built a spacious reception hall and 4 other buildings out of rough pine boards. So Perry's already making threats. He's only just got there, and he says, well, we're going to go to war if you don't meet our demands. There are 50 ships very nearby, 50 more in California. California is only 18 days away, so you just hurry up. And Japanese, well, this time, they had an official artist, and his name was Hibata Oscar, and he was a pupil of Kuniyoshi. There was a second official artist called Takagawa Bunsen, and he did a gorgeous thing called the Perry Scroll, which is in the British Museum, and Tim Clark very kindly let me take lots of photographs of it. So there are the ships on the horizon. And here are the Japanese preparing for the arrival of the Americans. So they've been there 3 weeks already, and they begin formal negotiations. So at 11:30, at the escort embark in 27 boats and pull up in 2 lines parallel to the beach. Let's see if this works. Oh, pathetic little lines. Anyway, there are the soldiers, there are the Americans coming off their boats. I think this is... Oh, here it goes. Yeah. And then, there are the Americans again, landing on the beach. Perry climbs into his barge. There's a 17-gun salute. As I said to you, that's very noisy. That's an awful lot of noise from those ships. And he goes ashore. So Perry has 500 fully armed men, sailors, marines, and 3 bands. The Japanese, he's browbeaten them into not really being armed at all. There's just some guards with pikes and bows and matchlocks. And there are other artists besides Hibata Oscar who are doing drawings, not so good as Perry's, but you notice as Hibata Oscar, but they're very interested in the buttons, because there aren't buttons on Japanese clothes, and they're very interested in the weapons and the uniforms. And Hibata, meanwhile, is doing his very precise illustrations. And the sightseers crowd to have a look at the alien Americans. Here's some sightseers. More sightseers. More sightseers. And the bands, the American bands, play the Star-Spangled Banner. And Perry, this is an American picture, followed by officers and 6 black stewards, marches to the reception hall between 2 lines of Marines and soldiers. And now, this time it's a 21-gun salute. There's an awful lot of salutes going on. A 21-gun salute. The ships fire a 21-gun salute in honour of the Emperor, and a 17-gun salute in honour of Hayashi. And the commissioners arrive in a double-decker imperial barge, rather splendid. So they talked for 3 hours. The conversation went back and forth between Japanese to Dutch to English and back again. So there were lots of Japanese interpreters who could speak Dutch, but they couldn't speak English because they hadn't had any reason to learn English so far. And documents were exchanged. Perry had been delegated to ask for 1 port to be opened. But off his own bat, he thought, well, the Japanese are so conciliatory, I'll ask for 5. So he just, without being authorised to ask for it, he just said, okay, give me 5 ports. And negotiations finally were concluded. So it was time for celebrations and for the presentation of gifts. And the Americans gave a telegraph, which they set up, and they gave a lifeboat, they gave Audubon's birds, the natural history of the state of New York, some Madeira, some whiskey, more alcohol, a telescope, and most interesting to everybody, a little train. And this was a scale model, quarter-sized train with a fully furnished interior, including miniature benches and curtains. So in exchange, here's the little train. The Japanese gave silks, brocades, lacquerware, and rice. 200 sacks of rice carried by sumo wrestlers to show off their strength were given to Perry. And the Japanese were very curious to see how the Americans would respond to the sumo wrestlers. So they have lots of pictures of sumo wrestler trying to punch him in the stomach or feeling his stomach. So as far as they're concerned, the Americans were terribly impressed with these sumo wrestlers, staggered. Here are sumo wrestlers as depicted by the Americans. And there was actually a big display of sumo wrestling. And Francis Hawkes wrote in the official narrative, these overfed monsters, the Americans didn't think much of this at all, these overfed monsters glared with brutal ferocity at each other, like a pair of fierce bulls. And Williams, the missionary, wrote, it was a curious barbaric spectacle, reminding one of the old gladiators, exhibiting the difference between our civilization and usages and those of the secluded pagan people. And he added that the American gifts showed the success of science and enterprise of a higher civilization, and the sumo wrestlers a disgusting display of brute animal force put on by a partially enlightened people. So, time for reciprocal entertainment. Perry gave a huge party on shipboard, so they actually turned the deck into a marquee. Here's the cannons on the deck, there are the flags. Some of the top commissioners were entertained in Perry's own cabin, and then lots of other guys were at long tables on deck. And to show how very, very civilized they were, the Americans put on a minstrel show. They blacked up. And Perry very much liked what he called his Ethiopian troupe. This was called an Ethiopian concert. This was the thing in America in exactly 1850. It was very, very popular. Lots of wisecrack, lots of skits, lots of dancing. The Slave and the Dandy was one of the skits. Popular songs including Jump Jim Crow. Remember, this is pre-Civil War. And apparently the Japanese, you'll notice that the Japanese artists draw it as if the Americans are wearing masks, like no masks. And apparently they thought it was very funny. They enjoyed it very much. And everyone drank a lot, and at the end of the evening, one of the Japanese commissioners put his arm around Perry's shoulders and said, "Nippon America, all one heart," showing off his command of English. And Perry, I think this is rather nasty, he says he wrote that he thought to himself, if he would just sign my treaty, he can kiss me. So Perry was not so friendly. And the artists were able to look around the ship. They were very curious about lots of things like the black stokers, the Chinese crew, and the artist. There he is, the artist, William Heine. So on March the 31st, 1854, Perry went on shore. They signed the treaty in Dutch, Chinese and English. It was an accord of peace and friendship. It's the Treaty of Kanagawa, and they opened 2 ports in the end, Hakodate and Shimoda, to American ships for provisions and the refuge, and they also allowed for the refuge and treatment of shipwrecked sailors. And there was also one secret clause, which the commissioners, the negotiators, didn't dare tell the government at the time. They only revealed it later. We'll come to that in a minute. So the Japanese hosted a banquet, and there was a very nice dinner with raw oysters, mushroom soup, seaweed, boiled bream. Here is Perry, looking rather sort of rather snooty at the end. This is the missionary, Williams, and this is Perry's son, Oliver. Here's another picture of shaking of hands. And here's, by another artist, a little less respectful, showing the Americans being rowdy and not being able to sit properly in Japanese style. And here is a nice portrait of Perry. And here is his son, Oliver. And this is a satirical view of the coming of the black ships, depicting the American president as a kind of deity, with Perry as his high priest. So, time marches on. Britain and Russia continue fighting over Crimea, and Sir James Stirling, representing Britain, shows up in Nagasaki in September that same year. He's not interested in doing trade with the Japanese. He wants them to close their ports to Russian ships because Britain is at war with Russia. But he completely fails. Number one, his interpreter is no good. Number two, the Japanese don't get it. Why should they close their ports to Russian ships? So they don't. And in fact, 2 months later, Admiral Powhatan, the Russian ambassador, the Russian admiral, shows up in Shimoda and immediately makes a treaty with the Japanese. So his is the second treaty, it's with the Russians. And all those Russians are down in Shimoda, sign their treaty, and there is a mammoth earthquake. And this is obviously the gods finally expressing their wrath. They're fed up with all these foreigners intruding on Japanese soil. And so Shimoda is completely destroyed, and all the Russian ships are destroyed. So the Russians have to build new ships, and they have to get Japanese to help them. So it's a great chance for the Japanese to really get a lesson in how to make Russian ships. So they rebuild their fleet in Shimoda. And 2 years goes by. 2 years goes by, and a ship appears in Shimoda. You know where Shimoda is, don't you? It's just down, not that far from the city of Edo, sort of, not very far from the mouth of Edo Bay. So 2 years has gone by, 2 years has passed, and finally the negotiators have confessed what this last clause was in the treaty, but they hadn't dared to confess to before. And that was to allow an American consul to live in Japan. And a ship shows up in Shimoda, and on it is 2 men, just 2. And one is a man called Townsend Harris, and the other is his secretary and interpreter called Henry Houston. Now, Townsend Harris is a failed businessman from New York, doesn't have a family, doesn't have a job, and said to the American president, well, you need a consul general in Japan, why not send me? And he persuaded him. So he's 52 and Houston is 24. And after a lot of argumentation, they are finally given a temple to live in. It's called Gyokusenji. It's in Shimoda. If anyone has any doubts about where Shimoda is, by the way, I'll try and put up a map later on and show you. This is one of Houston's drawings, young Houston, who was Townsend Harris's interpreter and secretary. And of course, in time-honoured fashion, the first thing they say to the authorities in Shimoda is, we need women. So the governors give them a geisha each. Townsend Harris gets a geisha called Okichi, and Henry Huisken gets a geisha called Ofuku. And so Henry Huisken, who is Dutch, speaks Japanese, so he can communicate with the shogun's interpreters, Japanese to Dutch, and then he can also speak English to Townsend Harris. So that's how the negotiations work. And Henry Huisken wrote a memoir which is fantastic. It's really charming. And Townsend Harris also wrote a memoir. Here is Henry Huisken's bedroom, where he set up his bed on the tatami. And they have endless meetings with the governors of Shimoda. Here they are, and here are the governors. And they spend 16 months. Basically, it's just these two guys. So Perry came with hundreds of guys. This is just these two guys. And yet again, they have a pesky letter. And this time they say, we must deliver this letter into the hands of the shogun. And the government up in Edo says, what? First of all, we're not having these foreigners walking across Japan. Secondly, he's not coming anywhere near the shogun, no way. So messages go back and forth between the governors in Shimoda, who have to deliver what the government in Edo is saying, and they say, well, you can just negotiate with us. But Townsend Harris won't. He says, nope, I'm only going to give this letter into the hands of the shogun. And he has a threat. It's not, in the case of Perry, it's American force, it's his own force. In the case of Townsend Harris, he says, you know the British are in China. The Second Opium War has now begun, by the way. You know what they're doing in China. You know that they're basically taking it over. They're raping, they're pillaging, they're murdering, they're enslaving, they're colonizing. They'll be over here with 50 ships and they'll blast you out of the water if you don't do as we say. So the fact, they're just two little guys, but they have this threat of British force. And they finally, after a year and a half of back and forth negotiations, they are finally allowed to travel across, from Shimoda, across the mountains to Edo. They go by palanquin, because that's the way people travelled in those days, and they have to have special palanquins, specially built, so that they can stick their legs out in front of them, because they can't bend them like Japanese do. So they have to have special long palanquins for their legs. And whenever Huisken is out of sight of anybody, he goes on horseback because it's much more comfortable, but it's not so dignified. So whenever he's in a town, he has to get back into this, has to jam his poor limbs inside this palanquin again. And they get to Edo. They go through the city gates. They are the first Westerners, other than the Dutch, ever to see Edo. And it's just these two guys, And they go up to Edo Castle, and they cross the bridge, they go into the castle grounds, and they go into the grand audience hall. Now this is Nijo Castle, which is like, this is like a sort of miniature. Nijo Castle, if you've been there in Kyoto, is like a miniature of what Edo Castle was like. So if you picture this multiplied 1,000-fold, what Huisken wrote was that there were 300 or 400 daimyo and high nobles sitting in exact rows, all facing in one direction. They were all clad in court dresses and all sitting like statues. And Huisken mentioned that the ceilings were 30 feet high and commented on the most profound silence despite the great numbers of courtiers. So finally they get to see the shogun. And they have the letter from the president in a box with the American flag on it. So Harris has a really splendid uniform. It's a completely bogus uniform. He designed it himself. It's a navy blue dress coat, gold braid, navy blue pantaloons, cocked hat, gold tassels, pearl-handled dress sword. Doesn't mean anything, it's just his uniform, so he looks very grand. And Huisken is in undress naval uniform with regulation sword and cocked hat. And Huisken wrote how amazing it was that just these two guys could walk right into the Holy of Holies. He wrote that it's the star of progress rising in Asia, taking away the darkness from their heathen minds, and so on. But it also shows how very civilized the Japanese were, that they didn't leap up and, cut these guys to pieces, but they didn't. They just knelt there, very disciplined. And so they walked in, they presented their letter. And What happened next was that the trade treaty was negotiated. 7 ports were open to American ships. The Americans were to be allowed to settle and trade initially in Yokohama. And there was a special treaty which meant that the Americans would pay the bare minimum of customs dues. Basically, these were the unequal treaties. These gave many more rights to the Americans than it did to the Japanese. And if the Americans committed a crime on Japanese soil, they would be tried by their own countrymen, who of course would find them innocent. And an American envoy would be installed in Edo. And after that, the deluge. Eventually, the British finally showed up. Lord Elgin turned up, taking time off from the Opium Wars, and Harris had said that he would come with 50 ships and blow Japan out of the water. He didn't do that. He came with 1 ship, and he made a very nice treaty. And then the Japanese also signed treaties with the Dutch, the French, and the Russians in very short order. And this is a picture. It's called Peoples of Barbarian Lands, Englishmen. And there's a little poem by the artist Kanagaki Rogo. Even people who live far from us will feel our divine wind and think of Japan. Now, what I haven't told you is how Princess Atsu fitted in and what she did. And in fact, she had a major part to play, a secret part. She was a sort of undercover agent with Saigo, the last samurai, helping her. And if you want to read her very dramatic and romantic story, you could read it in my novel. I do have a few copies downstairs, and I have a nice gold stamp I can stamp it with another side. Thank you.